Hello, my name is Stephen Morton. I'm a professor of English at Southampton, and together with Dr. Susan Kelly at Goldsmiths College, a senior lecturer in art, we've been planning a project on a post-colonial history of rehabilitation. The Southampton Institute of Arts and Humanities generously provided seed funding for a larger bid, which allowed us to pay a doctoral research assistant to design and develop impact activities with project partners. These included 2 prison arts organisations, an international museum and a gallery, and I'll say more about these impact activities in a moment. But first, a little more about the project. So a post-colonial history of rehabilitation aims to provide the first thorough comparative study of a topic that's widely debated in the media and has major legal and political consequences for ideas of criminal justice, national security and human rights, but which legal and cultural historians have not fully explored or understood. The extremist attacks on London Bridge in 2019 by a former convicted terrorist who had participated in the UK disengagement and desistance programme have recently prompted renewed criticisms of rehabilitation, criticisms that repeat the popular view that rehabilitation inevitably leads to reoffending. What such oft-repeated criticisms of prison rehabilitation overlook are the ways in which penal culture and the rule of law both shaped and were shaped by the idea of empire and the range of disciplinary practices it gave rise to in different colonial spaces. This project charts a post-colonial history of rehabilitation with reference to a range of related but distinct events and archival sources, from prison discipline in 19th-century colonial India to debates about rehabilitation and penal labour in the context of counter-insurgency operations during the Kenyan land and freedom struggle of the 1950s and the counter-extremist rehabilitation programmes of the early 21st century. Drawing on approaches to the study of disciplinary power and discourse developed in literary and cultural studies, the project will investigate how the idea of rehabilitation has continued to have such a strong and enduring appeal in the fields of criminal justice and counter-terrorism, despite repeated criticisms of its failings. By placing the long history of rehabilitation in a wider global context of political struggles over sovereignty, governance and citizenship, the project also considers how rehabilitation has come to shape and inform a range of practices that extend beyond the field of criminal justice, including counter-terrorism, forced labour, and psychiatry. In doing so, the project will aim to make an important and original contribution to current public debates about the legacy of the British Empire. Turning to research questions, the research questions that the project seeks to address. So the modern practice of rehabilitating criminals and political prisoners, as we've suggested, has a fascinating, complex and largely overlooked colonial history, which continues to shape cultural stereotypes of race and criminality. Examining this history can help to forge a better public understanding of why a disproportionately larger number of people of colour are incarcerated in the UK, as is borne out by David Lammy's recent report of 2018. While this history begins with convict labour in the 18th and 19th century imperial world, it was fully developed as a practice of counter-insurgency in the theatre of anti-colonial liberation struggles in the mid-20th century, and was later adapted in the contemporary global war on terror. This project provides an in-depth post-colonial history of the uses and techniques of rehabilitation, from the age of the British Empire to the present. It analyses how this legacy of empire and race thinking informs the criminal justice system, counter-extremism and psychiatric care in the UK today. Our contention is that rehabilitation never merely aimed at reforming insurgents or returning criminals to civil society after a period of imprisonment. It also produced a powerful and enduring set of moral norms, racial discourses, and interpretive frameworks that shaped and legitimized prevailing ideas about discipline, education, work, and citizenship in modern society. documenting and analysing the colonial history of rehabilitation and its post-colonial legacies is particularly crucial as it enables a better understanding of how race and culture underpin the specific institutional processes that define vulnerable, sick, or dangerous subjects who are in need of rehabilitation. Through a collaborative research process involving a cultural historian, an artistic researcher, 2 leading prison arts organisations, and an artist filmmaker, the project will result in an essay film, a monograph, an edited volume, as well as other outputs, a series of public events, screenings, and targeted impact activities with prisons, museums, and galleries that attempt to answer 3 central questions about the origins, form, and function of practices of rehabilitation. Firstly, what constitutes the field of rehabilitation? So the project identifies the key disciplinary contours and objectives of colonial rehabilitation across a range of selected case studies from Asia and Africa that have been selected because of the light they shed on the colonial past, on the colonial history of rehabilitation. The project traces the development of rehabilitation techniques from the penal colonies of 19th century India to the counter-insurgency heart and mind operations during the states of emergency in Malay and Kenya in the 1950s, to contemporary forms of prison rehabilitation and desistance programs in the UK. The project identifies significant gaps in understanding how colonial histories of race shape the fields of criminology and psychology, and investigates how these histories can shed new light on the legacies of empire in prisons and mental health institutions today. Our second question, how have subjects and practices of rehabilitation been constructed and defined, starts by interrogating the claim made by colonial administrators that rehabilitation sought to produce and remake colonial subjects through programs of moral, psychological, and ideological re-education. In doing so, the project will examine the slippage between the liberal ideal of reform and the often violent military techniques of counterinsurgency. It will investigate first how particular practices of rehabilitation invented a specialized language to categorize vulnerable individuals, which drew on the discourse of ethnopsychiatry and colonial education policies. It will look too at how a moral language of therapy and personal moral responsibility was invented to de-radicalize militants, and consider how these ideas of rehabilitation have been adapted and generalized to frame a wide range of vulnerable subjects, from criminals, terrorists, and insurgents to the unemployed and the mentally ill. Finally, the project will address what are the social, political, and economic implications of practices of colonial rehabilitation today. It will explore how the legacy of colonial practices of rehabilitation in the context of counterinsurgency shapes ideas and techniques of rehabilitation across the fields of criminology, psychology, and counterinsurgency. To address the far-reaching contemporary implications of this historical research, we plan to engage with prison arts organisations, the prison arts organisations TIP and Rideout, through prison theatre workshops conducted in the Midlands and Greater Manchester, and with psychiatric patients, clinicians, art therapists, artists, and researchers through a salon series event at the Bethlehem Gallery in London. Turning now to the methods of our project. So the project will, in methodological terms, develop quite a distinctive co-research methodology involving archival research, textual analysis, interviews, visual analysis, and practice-led research in prison theatre and experimental film that is specifically designed to interrogate the gaps in the official archives of colonial rehabilitation. This methodology will also allow the project team to examine the legacies of this colonial history. It will consider how this longer history has been adapted and transformed by states such as Saudi Arabia and Singapore in the context of the global war on terror, and consider how that history also informs current thinking about rehabilitation, race and criminality in the British criminal justice system today. The project starts from the position that to tell the colonial history of rehabilitation and its legacies, we need to combine the perspectives and techniques of cultural, visual and literary history, postcolonial histories of criminology, counter-insurgency and psychology, the practice-led research methods of prison arts, and performance techniques drawn from the creative practice of essay filmmaking. Cultural and literary historical methods will allow us to identify what is missing from official archives and records, as well as the evidence they contain. Postcolonial histories of counterinsurgency, crime, and ethnopsychiatry have already established that colonial subjects were framed as a threat to be contained and retrained according to the principles of moral individualism. Our research will extend these methods by using archival materials and open-ended interviews as a resource for the design of prison arts workshops that will explore how race, criminality, and rehabilitation are understood in the context of contemporary British prisons. The experiences, perspectives, and questions that these workshops generate will provide an additional resource for the experimental essay film, which will investigate gaps in the official archives, particularly in respect of the techniques and spaces that have been used in former British colonies to rehabilitate political prisoners and the narratives that have been used to justify them. Documentation from the workshops and the film will then be used to frame each of the case studies in the monograph. The archival research that we aim to conduct will examine how the practice of rehabilitation was refined and developed as part of an imperial discourse of counterinsurgency and small wars at institutions such as the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst during the late 19th and early 20th century, before it was exported to the British colonies of Malay and Kenya in the 1950s. This task will involve us consulting official reports, military training manuals, memos, correspondence, and private papers relating to the uses of rehabilitation in the UK National Archives, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the Imperial War Museum, the Tavistock Archive, the Bethlehem Museum of the Mind, the International Labour Organization in Geneva, the National Archives of Kenya and Singapore, and the archives at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies of Singapore. To assess the legacy of this colonial history, we'll seek to interview military experts, prison service professionals, forensic psychologists, and where possible, former subjects of rehabilitation. We'll employ research assistants and translators in Saudi Arabia and Singapore to interview contemporary practitioners of counter-terrorist rehabilitation to understand how contemporary forms of rehabilitation compare with its use as a technique of counterinsurgency in former British colonies. The interview questions will focus on the following key topics: the use and significance of historical examples from the British colonial period for the development of rehabilitation in Saudi Arabia and Singapore, the political context in which rehabilitation was used, the specific objectives of rehabilitation, the techniques and processes of rehabilitation, and the ways in which subjects are monitored during and after their rehabilitation. Building on this combination of archival and open-ended interview methods, the project will then proceed to a practice-based research approach, combining the creative methods of prison theatre, performance, and the essay film. Through a series of knowledge exchange meetings with the artistic directors of TIP and Rideout, and with film director Margareta Kern, the project team will identify images, techniques, and narratives in the archival materials and interviews that will provide key resources for the design of the prison theatre workshops and the development of a script for the essay film. Video and sound recordings and transcripts from the interviews and workshops will provide source material for the film script and the production of key scenes in the essay film. Using the VR and green screen equipment available at Southampton's digital hub, we will reconstruct scenes from the archives and the prison workshops. In this way, the experimental methods of the essay film will use the techniques of reconstruction, voicing, and role play to preserve anonymity and to critically examine the scene of the interview. The essay film will also allow us to probe gaps and limits in the archives and interviews and to raise critical questions about the hidden histories and agendas of rehabilitation. The process of producing and editing the film will also allow the team to select and curate archival materials for a planned digital archive. Turning now then to speak a little more about the planned impact activities which we were discussing with Rideout, TIP, the Museum of British Colonialism and Bethlehem Gallery. In partnership with the Museum of British Colonialism and using the digital humanities resources available at Southampton, we will aim to produce a digital archive of materials containing transcripts of archival research, interviews, and visual reconstructions of rehabilitation techniques. The Museum of British Colonialism has already started to restore and make visible suppressed, destroyed, or underrepresented histories related to the British colonial past. By depositing a digital copy of our primary materials on the museum's website, we will make our research outputs accessible to an international public audience, particularly the African and South Asian public constituencies with which the museum has an established relationship. In so doing, the project will seek to change visitors' understanding of the colonial history of rehabilitation and its place in the wider histories that the museum seeks to address, while also enhancing the museum's public profile and increasing visitor numbers. We'll also design interactive online tools and questionnaires as part of this digital archive in order to gather data about the user's engagement with the website and to evaluate its impact. The planned Salon Series event at Bethlehem Gallery will invite therapists, clinicians, academics, and artists to engage with scenes from the film and materials from the digital archive to reflect on the medical and psychological framework in which colonial techniques of rehabilitation were often defined. For example, participants will be invited to engage with reports on ethnopsychiatry and rehabilitation in Kenya, images of rehabilitation pipelines, and contemporary sites of rehabilitation, such as the Mohammed bin Nayef Counselling and Care Centre, Saudi Arabia. For this event, the project team will also plan to produce a poster and a short visual essay for the Bethlehem Papers publication. And the plan here is for the visual essay to contain links to the project's main outputs.